The first thing Officer Daniel Rourke learned at ADX wasn't a rule, it was the silence. A silence so heavy it felt like the building itself was listening. He'd been on the job less than a month when he realized the place didn't operate like any other prison he'd worked in. Here, in the most fortified concrete labyrinth in America, noise wasn't just discouraged, it was feared. Every shift felt like walking through a pressure chamber where one mistake could set off a chain of consequences no one could fully predict. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. Rourke had been warned about inmate behavior, manipulation tactics, coded threats, yet nobody prepared him for the psychological fog that settled over staff the moment the gates clanged shut behind them. Every step along the sterile corridor echoed like a countdown. Every cell window, just a slit, held eyes capable of memorizing routines, gestures, weaknesses. The day everything shifted began with a routine escort. In ADX, routine was a lie nobody admitted out loud. A high-risk inmate, isolated for over a decade, was being transferred to a different tier for monitoring after showing signs of self-neglect. Rourke followed the lead officer, eyes locked on the inmate's shackled wrists. The man never spoke, never blinked, never broke his stare from Rourke's face. It was that same expression every time, calculating, patient, waiting for a crack in the armor. But partway through the corridor, the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then a full second of darkness swallowed the hallway. When the emergency lights kicked in, Rourke felt it instantly, something had shifted. The inmate had moved half an inch. Just enough to show he could break routine whenever he wanted. Just enough to remind the officers that isolation didn't erase awareness, it sharpened it. Later that night, the lead officer pulled Rourke aside and spoke low, as if the walls could hear. "Don't give them anything," he warned. "Not your voice, not your fear, not even how tired you are. They can smell burnout before your supervisor ever will." Burnout. The word lingered like a warning label. Rourke had begun feeling it already, the insomnia, the constant scanning of shadows, the sense that the prison's concrete angles followed him home. He'd catch himself checking door locks twice, then 3 times. He'd wake up before dawn convinced someone was standing at the foot of his bed. His wife called it work stress. He called it something different, something he couldn't name without sounding paranoid. By week 8, even the veterans looked worn. Officers who once spoke with confidence now whispered in half-sentences and clenched their jaws through every shift. Each man carried a private fatigue that made them avoid eye contact. No one wanted to admit how close they were to breaking. But the tipping point came during a late-night perimeter check. Rourke walked past a service corridor and heard a muffled sound behind the steel door. Not an inmate. Not another officer. Something else. A whisper. A single, breathy word pressed through the vent, "Rourke." He froze. Nobody should have known his name. Nobody inside that wing should have even known he existed. He stepped back, pulse banging in his ears, scanning the shadows for movement. The corridor stretched out in front of him, cold and empty. Yet the voice replayed in his mind, quiet, precise, as if spoken by someone who had been listening for weeks. He reported it the next morning, but the supervisor brushed it off. "Faulty acoustics," he said. "Maybe an echo. Maybe stress." Rourke didn't believe him. Not after what he'd seen in the inmate's eyes. Not after what he felt standing alone in that corridor. As he left the office, another officer caught him by the arm. "Don't push it," the man whispered. "You ask too many questions in this place, you become the problem." Rourke walked out slowly, unsure which unnerved him more, the inmate who said his name, or the staff who acted like it wasn't surprising at all. The morning after the whispered voice, Rourke walked into the control room and felt every pair of eyes flick toward him, then away. Not in curiosity, more like calculation. ADX had a way of turning even co-workers into observers, measuring who was slipping and who could keep their mask on. He kept his expression calm, but his nerves were raw. The more he tried to shake off the unease, the stronger it clung to him. officers weren't supposed to show emotional cracks. At ADX, a crack wasn't just weakness, it was an opening. The next shift exposed just how deep the staff culture ran. During briefing, a veteran named Hale leaned close and spoke without moving his lips. "Don't mention voices again. Not unless you want the shrink evaluating you for removal." It wasn't kindness. It was a warning wrapped in protocol. Rourke nodded, but inside, something twisted. If the staff didn't want to talk, that meant there was something worth hiding. The day's assignment took him to Range 5, the wing housing inmates known for psychological manipulation. Men who studied officers like puzzles. Men who treated silence as a weapon. One inmate in particular, Brewer, sat perfectly still behind his cell door, eyes locked on Rourke with unsettling clarity. He wasn't violent. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply watched, as though memorizing every detail from posture to breathing rhythm. As Rourke passed, Brewer spoke without raising his voice. "You're tired, Officer Rourke. They can't hide that from us." The words hit harder than a shouted threat. How did he know? How did any of them know? Rourke reported the interaction. Hale shrugged. "They always know. You can work here 10 years and never speak to one, and they'll still read you better than your family." That night, in the staff break room, Rourke overheard a conversation between two officers trying, and failing, to sound casual. They talked about burnout rates, transfers, breakdowns. A supervisor who quit mid-shift. Another who started carrying a second set of keys home because he couldn't trust himself to leave the job behind. Rourke interrupted. "Why doesn't anyone talk about this officially?" Both men stared at him like he'd crossed a forbidden line. One of them finally said, "Because it makes the place look weak. And weak institutions can't handle the kind of men we house here." Later, while reviewing logbooks, Rourke made a discovery that snapped everything into place. A pattern, subtle but undeniable. Every officer who reported signs of severe stress was quietly moved to less visible roles or reassigned entirely. Their files didn't list burnout. They didn't list mental fatigue. Instead, sanitized phrases appeared: administrative rotation, operational reassignment, internal restructuring. It wasn't support. It was concealment. The system didn't fix burnout. It buried it. And the more Rourke studied the records, the more he realized the voice he heard wasn't an isolated incident. Other officers had reported strange moments too: footsteps behind them during empty shifts, inmates knowing personal details no one shared, a sense of being watched long after the cameras turned away. But none of it made it into official reports. The weight of the truth settled over him. ADX wasn't just a prison built to contain danger. It was an environment designed to absorb it, silently, relentlessly, until the staff became as isolated as the inmates they guarded. And then, right as Rourke closed the final file, he noticed a handwritten note slipped inside. No signature. No date. Just 5 words: "You're not the first, Daniel." He froze. Only a handful of people even knew his first name. And none of them wrote in handwriting like that. Rourke carried the note in his pocket for 2 days before he found the nerve to show it to anyone. But showing it meant admitting he was unraveling, and at ADX, unraveling was the first step toward being pushed quietly out the door. So he kept it hidden, folded so tightly the crease cut into the paper like a scar. The breaking point came during an early morning rotation. The corridors were colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and stayed there. Rourke was making his rounds when he passed Brewer's cell again. The inmate sat in the exact same position as before, spine straight, eyes unblinking. Brewer didn't speak. He didn't need to. His gaze said enough: "I know something you don't." Rourke moved on quickly, fighting the rising pressure in his chest. The silence was suffocating today, heavier than any shift he'd worked. It felt like the air itself was waiting. Halfway down the corridor, Hale approached. His face was lined, jaw tight, as if he hadn't slept in days. He motioned Rourke into a small utility room and shut the door behind them. "You've been asking questions," Hale said quietly. "Too many." Rourke held his ground. "I'm trying to understand what's happening here. To all of us." Hale exhaled, a slow, defeated breath. "Then understand this, the system isn't built to protect us. It's built to keep the machine running. Burnout, anxiety, insomnia, they know it's happening. They just can't acknowledge it without admitting ADX grinds down its own people." Rourke pulled the folded note from his pocket and handed it over. Hale read it once. His expression didn't change, but the way he held the paper, careful, respectful, told Rourke everything. "You weren't supposed to get this," Hale said. "But every few years, someone does." "Who writes them?" "No one knows. Could be a former officer. Could be someone still inside. Or maybe it's just a reminder the walls don't forget the people who walk them." Rourke felt a chill run down his spine. "So what am I supposed to do with it?" Hale hesitated. "Decide whether you want to stay long enough to understand why that note exists." The shift ended in uneasy silence. When Rourke stepped outside the gates, the sunlight felt wrong, too bright, too foreign. His wife noticed the change immediately. He no longer spoke about work. He barely slept. Every sound in the house felt amplified, as if the ADX corridors had followed him home. One night, unable to shake the weight pressing on him, Rourke drove back to the prison perimeter and parked where the floodlights cast long shadows across the desert ground. He stared at the massive concrete structure, its angles, its stillness, its absolute control. And he finally understood. ADX didn't just break inmates. It reshaped the people who guarded them. Slowly. Quietly. Efficiently. Some officers cracked. Some disappeared into transfers. Some numbed themselves until they felt nothing at all. But all of them, every single one, left part of themselves behind those walls. Rourke realized he had a choice: stay and let the prison carve him hollow, or leave while he still recognized the person looking back at him in the mirror. By sunrise, his decision was made. He handed in his badge 3 days later. And as he walked out for the final time, he felt a strange mix of relief and grief. Leaving ADX meant reclaiming his life, but it also meant acknowledging the system would remain unchanged. The next officer would take his place. Then another. And another. The cycle would continue in silence, the truth buried behind protocol and concrete. But Rourke carried one final memory with him, a reminder scribbled in anonymous handwriting, still folded in his pocket. "You're not the first, Daniel." And he knew, whoever wrote it had been right. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.